Rain drummed against the windows of the small beach house like an old friend knocking for attention. David sat at his kitchen table, sketching building designs by lamplight, trying to lose himself in work. The sound of the storm should have been comforting, but tonight it only reminded him how alone he was in this quiet coastal town. 3 months had passed since he'd packed his life into boxes and driven north from the city. 3 months since his world fell apart when he came home early from a business trip to find his wife with someone else. The betrayal still stung, but the loneliness hit harder than the anger these days. This little rented house by the ocean was supposed to be his healing place, somewhere to figure out what came next. David pushed his reading glasses up his nose and looked out the rain-streaked window. Through the darkness, he could see the faint glow from the house next door. His neighbor lived there, a woman about his age who studied sea life for the research center down the coast. They'd started talking over morning coffee about a month ago, just casual conversations across their shared fence. Her name was Isabella, and she had this way of explaining complicated ocean science that made it sound like poetry. She'd moved here around the same time he did, though he never asked why. People came to places like this for 2 reasons. They were running towards something or running away from it. He figured they were both running away. Their morning talks had become the best part of his day. She'd appear on her back deck around 7, coffee mug in hand, dark hair pulled back in a messy bun. Sometimes she wore her work clothes, ready to collect samples from tide pools. Other times, she was in comfortable clothes, planning to spend the day writing research reports. David found himself timing his morning routine just to catch those conversations. They talked about everything: her work studying how climate change affected local sea creatures, his architectural projects, books they were reading, funny stories about adjusting to small-town life after years in bigger cities. What he didn't tell her was how much he looked forward to seeing her smile, or how her laugh made something tight in his chest loosen up, or how he'd started working later into the evening, partly to stay busy, but mostly because he could see her moving around, her house through the windows, and it made him feel less alone. Tonight was different, though. The storm had been building all day, and by evening the wind was howling like something angry. David had set up candles around his living room just in case the power went out. The old beach houses weren't known for reliable electricity during bad weather. He was deep in his sketches when the lights flickered once, twice, then died completely. The sudden darkness was so complete it took his eyes a moment to adjust. Only the candles he'd lit earlier gave any light, casting dancing shadows. On the walls, David sat back in his chair and listened to the storm rage outside. The wind was so loud he almost missed the soft knock at his front door. Almost. He grabbed a candle and walked through the dark hallway, wondering who would be out in weather like this. When he opened the door, his breath caught in his throat. Isabella stood there, rain glistening on her skin, her long hair damp and clinging to her shoulders. She was wearing a silk robe that the wind kept trying to pull away from her body. Her feet were bare, and he could see she was shivering slightly from the cold rain. But it wasn't the storm or her appearance that made him step back in surprise. It was her eyes. For 3 months, their conversations had been friendly but careful, like two people afraid to get too close. Tonight, standing in his doorway with lightning flashing behind her, she looked at him with an intensity that made his heart race. Isabella took a step forward, not waiting for an invitation. Her bare feet left wet prints on his wooden floor as she entered his house. The candles he'd placed around the room cast a warm, flickering light that made everything feel dreamlike. She turned to face him, and he could see she was nervous but determined. Her hands were shaking slightly, though whether from cold or nerves he couldn't tell. The silk robe had slipped off one shoulder, but she didn't seem to notice or care. They stood there for a long moment, just looking at each other. 3 months of careful friendship, of polite morning conversations, of pretending they didn't feel the electricity between them every time they talked. All of that careful distance suddenly felt silly and unnecessary. The storm outside seemed to fade into background noise. David realized he'd been holding his breath. Isabella was close enough now that he could smell her shampoo, something light and floral that reminded him of the jasmine that grew wild along the coastal paths. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again, Whatever she'd planned to say seemed to have gotten lost somewhere between her house and his front door. But her eyes said everything her voice couldn't. They said she was tired of being careful. They said she'd been thinking about him too. They said tonight felt different, like maybe they could stop pretending they were just neighbors who happened to enjoy morning coffee together. David set his candle down on the small table by the door. The simple action seemed to break whatever spell had kept them frozen in place. Isabella smiled then, not her usual polite neighbor smile, but something warmer and more real. The power was out in both their houses. The storm showed no signs of stopping anytime soon. And for the first time in 3 months, David wasn't thinking about his failed marriage or his uncertain future. He was only thinking about the brave, beautiful woman who had walked barefoot through a storm to get to his door. Something was about to change between them. He could feel it in the charged air, see it in the way she looked at him, sense it in the way his own heart was beating faster than it had in months. Whatever happened next would be different from their careful morning conversations. Tonight, the storm had washed away their caution, and they were about to discover what lay underneath. All that politeness. Isabella stood in her dark bathroom, water droplets still rolling down her arms from the shower she'd just finished. The power had gone out right as she was getting ready for bed, leaving her in complete darkness. She felt around for her phone and used its flashlight to find her silk robe hanging on the bathroom door. As she slipped into the soft fabric, she caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror. Even in the dim phone light, she could see someone she barely recognized looking back at her. For the past 3 months, she'd been so careful, so controlled. Every morning when she talked with David over their fence, she'd measured her words, kept her distance, made sure she didn't say anything that might reveal how much she looked forward to seeing him. But tonight felt different. Maybe it was the storm, or maybe it was just exhaustion from pretending she didn't feel anything special when he smiled at her. She was tired of being the sensible one, the woman who always made safe choices. Her last relationship had ended because she'd been too afraid to take risks, too worried about getting hurt to really open her heart. Through her bedroom window, she could see candlelight flickering in David's house. He was awake, probably working on his architectural drawings like he did most nights. She'd noticed his schedule, the way his light stayed on late while he lost himself in designing buildings for other people's dreams. Isabella sat on her bed and stared at that warm light coming from his windows. Her heart was beating faster than normal, and she knew why. For weeks, she'd been having thoughts about David that went way beyond neighborly friendship. The way he listened when she talked, about her research like her work actually mattered, how he made her laugh during their morning conversations, the way his eyes lit up when he got excited about an architectural project. She'd been alone for 8 months now, ever since her ex-boyfriend decided her career was too demanding and she was too independent for his liking. The breakup had been brutal, leaving her feeling like maybe she was too much for anyone to handle, but David never made her feel that way. He asked questions about her research, remembered details from previous conversations, treated her dreams like they were important. Standing up from her bed, Isabella walked to her window and looked across the small space between their houses. The storm was getting worse, rain hitting her window so hard it sounded like stones. Lightning flashed, lighting up the night for just a moment before everything went dark again. In that brief flash of light, she made a decision that surprised even her. She was going to stop being careful. She was going to stop measuring every word and analyzing every interaction. Tonight, with the storm raging and the power out and the whole world feeling upside down anyway, she was going to be honest about what she wanted. The walk from her bedroom to her front door felt like it took forever. Every step gave her another chance to change her mind, to be sensible, to grab a flashlight and some clothes and pretend she just needed help with the power outage. But she didn't want to be sensible anymore. She wanted to be brave. Opening her front door, the storm hit her immediately. Rain soaked through her robe in seconds, and the wind was so strong she had to hold onto the door frame to keep her balance. The wooden deck was slippery under her bare feet, and she could feel every grain of wet sand that had blown up from the beach. The short distance between their houses had never seemed so far. Each step was deliberate, purposeful. She wasn't just walking to ask for candles or check if his power was working. She was walking towards something that could change everything between them. The thought terrified and thrilled her at the same time. Lightning flashed again just as she reached his front door, and in that moment she saw her reflection in his window. Her dark hair was plastered to her head from the rain, and her silk robe clung to her body. She looked like someone who had made a choice, someone who had decided to stop playing it safe. Before she could lose her nerve, she knocked on his door. Not the polite, neighborly knock she might have used during the day, but something more urgent. Her heart was pounding so loud she was sure he'd hear it over the storm. When David opened the door, the look on his face made her glad she'd been brave. Surprise, concern, and something deeper flickered in his eyes as he took in her appearance. She was shivering from the cold rain, but she didn't step back or apologize for showing up at his door like this. Instead, she stepped forward into his warm, candle-lit house. Her wet feet left prints on his wooden floor, but she didn't care. The candlelight made everything feel magical, like they were in some kind of dream where the normal rules didn't apply. David closed the door behind her, shutting out the storm, but not the electricity that had been building between them for months. They stood there in his entryway, both of them knowing that whatever happened next would change their careful friendship forever. Isabella could feel water dripping from her hair onto her shoulders. The silk robe was practically see-through now, from the rain, but she felt no embarrassment. For the first time in months, she felt completely present in the moment, completely honest about what she wanted. She looked into David's eyes and saw her own feelings reflected there. The careful politeness they'd maintained during their morning conversations was gone, replaced by something real and immediate and terrifying in the best possible way. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside David's house, lit only by flickering candles, Isabella felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She'd stopped running from what she felt, stopped being afraid of wanting something more than safe, surface-level friendship. Now she just had to find the courage to tell him why she'd really come. Isabella stood in David's candlelit entryway, rain still dripping from her hair, and felt her carefully rehearsed words disappear completely. During the short walk between their houses, she'd imagined what she might say. Something casual about the power being out, maybe a joke about the storm. But now, looking into his eyes, all those safe conversations seemed pointless. David was staring at her like he couldn't quite believe she was really there. His hair was messy from running his hands through it while he worked, and he was wearing an old college sweatshirt that made him look younger somehow. The surprise on his face was slowly being replaced by something else, something that made her heart beat even faster. "I didn't come here about the power," she said, her voice barely louder than the rain against the windows. "I mean, my lights went out too, but that's not why I'm here." He took a step closer, close enough that she could smell his soap, something clean and simple that reminded her of ocean air. "Then why did you come?" Isabella felt her robe slip slightly off one shoulder, but she didn't adjust it. The wet silk was clinging to her skin, and she was suddenly very aware of how little she was wearing. But instead of feeling exposed, she felt powerful. For 3 months, she'd been so careful around David, so worried about saying the wrong thing, or giving away too much of what she was feeling. "Because I'm tired," she said, looking directly into his eyes. "I'm tired of pretending I don't think about you. I'm tired of measuring every word when we talk in the mornings. I'm tired of going to bed every night wishing I'd been braver during the day." David's eyes widened slightly, but he didn't step back. If anything, he seemed to lean closer, like he was hanging on every word she said. "I've been thinking about this conversation for weeks," Isabella continued, her voice getting stronger. "About what I would say if I ever got the courage to be honest with you. But now that I'm here, standing in your house in the middle of a storm, all those careful words seem stupid." She took a deep breath, tasting the salt air that had followed her in from outside. The candlelight flickered across David's face, and she could see he was holding his breath, waiting for whatever she was going to say next. "The truth is, David, I came here because tonight feels different. Like maybe we can stop being so polite with each other. Maybe we can stop pretending we're just neighbors who happen to enjoy talking about ocean science and building designs." The words hung in the air between them, bold and honest and terrifying. Isabella felt like she'd just jumped off a cliff, not knowing if David would catch her or let her fall. For a moment, the only sound was the storm outside and their own breathing. Then, David smiled, not his usual friendly neighbor smile, but something warmer and more real. "I've been thinking about you too," he said quietly. "More than I probably should." Relief flooded through Isabella's chest. She'd taken the leap, and he hadn't backed away. "What kind of thinking?" she asked, surprised by her own boldness. David ran his hand through his hair, a nervous gesture she'd noticed during their morning conversations. "The kind where I started timing my morning routine just to make sure I'd be outside when you came, out for coffee. The kind where I work late partly to stay busy, but mostly because I can see your lights on and it makes me feel less alone in this place." Isabella felt warmth spread through her chest. All this time she'd been worried she was reading too much into their friendship, imagining chemistry that wasn't really there. But he'd been feeling it too, had been just as careful as she was about keeping his distance. "I moved here to get away from someone who made me feel like I was too much," she said, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "Too independent, too focused on my career, too complicated. But you never make me feel that way. You ask about my research like it matters. You remember things I tell you. You make me feel like being myself is actually a good thing." David reached out then, his fingers barely touching her arm, but the contact sent electricity through her whole body. "You're not too much," he said firmly. "Your ex was an idiot if he couldn't see how amazing you are." The simple words hit Isabella harder than any grand romantic gesture could have. This was what she'd been missing, what she'd been afraid she might never find again. Someone who saw her strength as something beautiful instead of something threatening. She let her robe slip a little more off her shoulder, not caring anymore about being proper or modest. The wet silk pooled slightly around her feet, but she kept her eyes on David's face. "I need you to know something," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I didn't come here looking for complicated. I didn't come here to play games or analyze what this means for our friendship." David's hand was still touching her arm, his thumb tracing small circles on her skin. "What did you come here for?" Isabella took one more step closer to him, close enough now that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. The candlelight cast shadows across his face, making everything feel dreamlike and urgent at the same time. "I came here," she said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper, "because I realized something tonight. I realized that I don't want to be careful anymore. I don't want to spend another night wondering what would happen if I was brave enough to tell you how I feel." She paused, letting her robe fall completely to the floor in one fluid motion. Standing there in the flickering candlelight, she felt more vulnerable and more powerful than she had in years. Looking into David's eyes, she spoke the words that would change everything between them. "You're mine tonight." It wasn't a question or a request. It was a declaration, a claim, a promise. It was 3 months of careful friendship finally being honest about what it really was. It was Isabella choosing courage over caution, choosing to risk her heart one more time because some things were worth the risk. And from the way David was looking at her, like she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen, she knew she'd made the right choice. The words hung in the candlelit air between them like a bridge that could either connect them or collapse under the weight of what Isabella had just confessed. David looked at her standing there, vulnerable but strong, and felt something shift inside his chest. 3 months of careful friendship had just been stripped away in a single moment of honesty. He reached out slowly, giving her time to change her mind, and touched her face gently. Her skin was still cool from the rain, but her eyes were warm with something that made his heart race. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because once we cross this line, we can't go back to just being neighbors who talk over the fence." Isabella leaned into his touch, her eyes never leaving his. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life. I'm tired of being afraid, David. I'm tired of letting fear make my choices for me." They moved together then, not rushed or desperate, but with the certainty of two people who had been moving toward this moment for months without realizing it. David led her to the couch in his living room, the one positioned perfectly to watch the ocean through his big windows. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside they created their own shelter from the world. They talked through the night. Wrapped in soft blankets, David pulled from his bedroom, sharing stories they'd never told anyone else. Isabella told him about her childhood growing up near the coast, how her father had been a fisherman who taught her to read the moods of the ocean before she could properly read books. She talked about her failed relationship, how her ex had made her feel like her passion for marine science was just a hobby that would eventually fade. He used to say I cared more about sea turtles than I did about building a real life with him, she said, her voice soft in the candlelight. Like studying how climate change affects ocean life wasn't real work, wasn't important enough to build a future around. David traced gentle patterns on her arm as she spoke, amazed by how much he was learning about the woman he'd been falling for during their morning coffee conversations. He was wrong, he said firmly. What you do matters. You're trying to save entire ecosystems. That's not a hobby, that's a calling. Isabella looked at him with such gratitude it made his chest tight. No one's ever talked about my work that way before, like it's actually important. It is important, David insisted. You are important. Then it was David's turn to share. He told her about his marriage, how it had slowly fallen apart over 2 years before he finally came home to find his wife with someone else. He talked about feeling like he'd been living someone else's idea of success, designing houses that made other people rich while he felt empty inside. I used to love architecture, he said, looking out at the storm through the window. I got into it because I wanted to create spaces where people could be happy, where families could build memories. But somewhere along the way, it became just about money and deadlines and impressing clients I didn't even like. Isabella shifted closer to him on the couch, her head finding a comfortable spot on his shoulder. What changed? What made you remember why you loved it? David was quiet for a moment, thinking. Honestly, talking to you. Those morning conversations where you'd get so excited explaining how ocean currents work, or how you can tell the health of an entire ecosystem just by studying one species. You reminded me what it feels like to be passionate about something that matters. They shared more than just stories that night. Isabella showed him the small scars on her hands from years of working with sea creatures, some from coral cuts, others from handling research equipment in rough waters. Each mark told a story of dedication to work she loved, work that had meaning beyond a paycheck. David showed her the calluses on his fingers from his woodworking hobby, something he'd taken up after his divorce as a way to create something beautiful with his hands. He'd been making small pieces of furniture, birdhouses, decorative items for his rental house. It was the first time in years that building something felt like art instead of just business. I've been thinking about changing my whole approach to work, he admitted as dawn started to creep through the windows. Maybe focusing on smaller projects, homes for families instead of office buildings for corporations, places where people can actually be happy. Isabella smiled against his shoulder. I think that sounds perfect. The world needs more beautiful spaces, places designed by someone who actually cares about the people who'll live there. As morning light began to filter through the storm clouds, they found themselves still talking, still discovering new things about each other. The power was still out, but neither of them cared. They had candles, they had coffee David could make on his gas stove, and they had each other. Isabella realized she'd never felt more understood by another person. David listened to her dreams about expanding her research, maybe writing a book about climate change effects on coastal ecosystems. He didn't look bored when she got excited about water temperature data or migration patterns. Instead, he asked questions that showed he was really listening, really interested in what mattered to her. David, meanwhile, felt more alive than he had in years. Isabella's courage in showing up at his door had given him permission to be brave. Too, to admit that he wanted more than just polite morning conversations. She made him remember what it felt like to connect with someone on a level deeper than small talk and shared routines. The storm outside was beginning to calm as the sun rose, but inside David's house, something new was just beginning. They had moved past the careful distance of neighborly friendship into something real and honest and full of possibility. Whatever happened next, they would face it together, Two people who had chosen courage over caution and found something beautiful in the process. Sunlight streamed through David's windows, painting golden squares across the wooden floor where Isabella's silk robe still lay from the night before. She woke first, curled against David's side on the couch, momentarily confused by the unfamiliar surroundings. Then the memories of the storm, of her brave walk between houses, of everything they'd shared came flooding back. For just a moment, panic fluttered in her chest. She wasn't usually the kind of person who made impulsive decisions, especially not ones that involved showing up at someone's door in a silk robe during a thunderstorm. Her scientific mind was trained to analyze, to think through consequences, to approach everything methodically. But looking at David's peaceful face in the morning light, she felt no regret, only possibility. When David opened his eyes and saw her watching him, there was a brief moment of morning awkwardness, the kind that comes when you wake up somewhere new, with someone new, after a night that changed everything. But then Isabella smiled, the same genuine smile that had made him fall for her during their fence conversations, and the awkwardness melted away. "Good morning," she said softly, her voice a little hoarse from all their talking through the night. "Morning," David replied, his own voice rough with sleep. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I have in months," Isabella admitted, and realized it was completely true. Despite sleeping on a couch, despite the storm, despite everything being new and uncertain, she'd slept more peacefully than she had since moving to this coastal town. David sat up slowly, running his hands through his messy hair. "I should make coffee. I think I have some eggs too if you're hungry." Isabella stretched, then wrapped the soft blanket around herself like a dress. She was wearing David's old college sweatshirt, which he'd given her sometime during the night when she got cold. It was too big for her, hanging past her knees, but it was comfortable and warm and smelled like him. "Coffee sounds perfect," she said, following him into the small kitchen. "But I should probably go back to my house first, get some actual clothes." David paused in the middle of getting coffee beans from the cabinet. "Do you want to go back?" he asked carefully. "I mean, you don't have to, but if you need space to think about what happened, I understand." Isabella walked over to where he stood by the counter and took his hands in hers. His fingers were warm and strong, with those woodworking calluses she'd traced the night before while he told her about his dreams of building beautiful things again. "I don't need space to think," she said firmly. "I told you last night that I was tired of being afraid, and I meant it. What I said about you being mine. I didn't just mean for one night, David. I meant it as a beginning, not an ending." Relief washed over David's face, followed by something that looked like wonder. "I was hoping you'd say that, but I need you to know something too. I'm still healing from everything that happened with my marriage. We both are, from our past relationships. I don't want to rush into anything that might hurt either of us." Isabella squeezed his hands gently. "I'm not asking you to rush. I'm just asking you to be honest with me about what you want. No games, no pretending to be less interested than we really are. We're both adults who've been hurt before, but we're also both brave enough to try again." David brought her hands to his lips and kissed her knuckles softly. "I want to try. I want to see where this goes, see what we can build together." They made breakfast together in David's small kitchen, moving around each other with surprising ease for two people who'd never shared the space before. David scrambled eggs while Isabella made toast, and they both laughed when they reached for the same cabinet at the same time and bumped into each other. "We'll have to work on our kitchen choreography," Isabella said, grinning as she buttered the toast. "Practice makes perfect," David replied, and something about the way he said it made Isabella's heart skip. The word practice implied a future, implied many more mornings like this one. They ate breakfast at David's small kitchen table, the same one where he'd been sketching the night before when the power went out. The storm had passed completely, now leaving behind a world that looked washed clean and bright. Through the window they could see the ocean sparkling in the morning sun, calm and peaceful after the night's chaos. "I should check on my house," Isabella said eventually, though she made no move to get up from the table. "Make sure the storm didn't damage anything." "We could check it together," David suggested. "Then maybe you could show me some of your research. I'd love to see what you're working on." Isabella smiled, remembering how her ex-boyfriend had never once asked to see her work, had never shown any real interest in the projects that meant everything to her. I'd like that. I'm working on a study about how rising ocean temperatures are affecting the migration patterns of sea turtles. It's complicated, but the data is fascinating. It sounds fascinating, David said, and Isabella could tell he meant it. I've always wondered how scientists track animal migrations. Do you use satellites or tags or what? As Isabella started explaining her research methods, she watched David's face light up with genuine interest. He asked smart questions, made connections between her work and things he'd noticed about the local coastline, treated her passion like something valuable and important. This was what she'd been missing, she realized. Not just romance or companionship, but someone who saw her work as part of what made her who she was, not something that competed with their relationship. After breakfast, they walked over to Isabella's house together. David held her hand as they crossed between their properties, a simple gesture that felt surprisingly significant. For months, this short distance had represented the careful boundary between their friendship and something more. Now, walking it together felt like claiming new territory. Isabella's house had weathered the storm well, with only a few small branches scattered across her deck. But as they cleaned up the debris together, she found herself thinking about the future in ways she hadn't dared to before. "David," she said as they carried the last branch to her compost bin, "what are you thinking about all this? About us? I mean..." David set down the branch and turned to face her fully. "Honestly, I'm thinking about how I haven't felt this hopeful about anything in a long time. I'm thinking about morning coffee conversations that turn into all-day conversations. I'm thinking about supporting your research and maybe finding a way to design buildings that are better for coastal environments." He paused, looking a little nervous. "I'm thinking about what it would be like to build something real together. Not just a relationship, but a life. Two people who are passionate about their work, who understand what it means to care about something bigger than themselves." Isabella felt tears prick at her eyes, but they were happy tears. "I'm thinking about all of that too. And I'm thinking about how last night was the bravest thing I've ever done, but it doesn't even feel scary anymore, it just feels right." 3 months later, their morning coffee conversations had evolved into something deeper and more beautiful than either of them had imagined. Isabella still lived in her house, David in his, but the space between their properties no longer felt like a boundary. It felt like home. David had started taking on smaller, more meaningful architectural projects, including designing a new research facility for the Marine Center where Isabella worked. Isabella had begun writing the book she'd dreamed about with David's encouragement and support. Sometimes Isabella still came over barefoot, but now it was natural rather than dramatic. She'd arrive with takeout from their favorite restaurant or a new piece of data she wanted to share, and David would be waiting with coffee and genuine interest in whatever was exciting her that day. The night of the storm had taught them both something important about courage, about the difference between being careful and being afraid. They'd learned that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is play it safe, that sometimes love requires you to walk barefoot through a storm to get to where you need to be. As Isabella knocked on David's door that evening, carrying tie, food and wearing no shoes as usual, she reflected on how much had changed since that night when she'd declared he was hers. Now they belonged to each other in ways that were deeper and more lasting than either had dared to hope. They'd built something real together, founded on honesty and mutual respect and the kind of love that makes two people braver than they ever were alone.